Thank you for reminding me. I can come back to it. To enter language is to be served of the real. The language, the same language, helps you socialize, and through that socialization, when you learn language, you also learn the social dictates, which means the norms that are held sacred by a society. Norms means there are certain dictates of a society which they call is the normative behavior. Normative means normal, normative behavior, and all the rest is considered to be abnormal behavior. This normative behavior is based on certain norms and traditions. That tradition holds normal and proper behavior. This a child acquires through the process called socialization. Through the socialization, he has accepted the real. The real has many systems in the society. The real has many systems in the society. Again, you came back to the structure, the idea of the structure. There are many structures in the society which through the real stage the child accepts, and the acceptance comes through language, because through language he is made aware of what this is, what education is, what other systems, how they work. Language makes him help to learn or how all the systems of the society work. This is one part of the definition that he gives. He says to enter language is to be served of the real. That, I repeat, that a child is introduced to the real stage through the introduction of language itself. So when a child is stopped from using certain words, or when he is made to say certain words, say before you begin eating, you say Bismillah, say a Muslim child. You are this language. To enter language is to be served of the real. The real is being created for him. And you don't say that word. And if he says a bad word, you ask the child to say astaghfirullah. What are you doing with that? You're using language. With language, he enters the real. Do you get my point? Or you don't touch that. You don't go there. These do's and don'ts is the language that serves him the real. This is your real. This is your normative behavior. Lacan then says this real is the inaccessible realm beyond signification. So we saw earlier on, we were talking in the same terms as Saussure was talking. We were talking in the same terms as Freud was talking. Saussure and Freud is what structure is, but what he talks about next, what Lacan talks about next, this, it's post-structuralism, it's Derrida. He says it's beyond signification. There is no signification of this real. Why? Because signification stops in the symbolic stage itself. Because any signification has to have a direct signifier having a signified. A direct signifier having a signified. But when that love object is snatched away from the child, this breaks down. The breaking down means one signifier will no more have one signified, but there will be millions of signifieds. And this signifier is never fixed onto one point. It's never fixed. But what does signifier take you to? It only takes you to a chain of signifiers, further signifiers, which means there is no signification. It's beyond the significant realm of signification, because now it takes you to a chain of signifiers alone with no signified. Clear? Now, after being severed from the mother's body, this is where the individual is never able to attain back that precious object that we once desired of in the symbolic stage. That precious object is the mother. Despite all our lives having spent hunting for it, what do you figure out that you are only doing? You are only trying to replace the desired object with other desires. Like I said, some spend this desire onto their career. It's imposition. It's like what we did in dream interpretation. It's called displacement. You are only displacing the desire of the mother in your career, in your making more money, or the desire of, tell me about the desires, various desires that human beings have, or food, gluttony. These are only displaced desires. Clear? So that displacement is what Derrida calls a chain of signifiers. And same is you and same is used by Lacan. I repeat the definition. To enter language is to be served of the real. The real is the inaccessible realm because it's beyond signification. The inaccessible realm beyond signification. Now, what does this child try to do? That uh, what this child is actually doing, like I said, he is trying to replace that initial desire. He is trying to substitute it various object. What Lacan calls it is the this object that he now replaces it with. He represents it with a small a. Lacan basically tries to give a mathematical definition of his the real stage. So he uses this little a for the replacements. I repeat, he uses the letter small a for the replacements, for the substitutes that are never ending, which vainly tries to fill the gap, that vainly tries to fill the gap. That is, according to Lacan, this lack, this trying to fill that gap is at the center of our being, because no being is without desires. The center of being is desire for Lacan. And this desire is basically replacements because the initial desire has been snatched away from the child. Is it clear so far? Any questions? You can unmute yourself and ask if you have any questions. You are allowed to unmute. The ter- Mahina, I did not get your questions. Unmute yourself and tell me what you're asking. Meanwhile, the term that Derrida uses for this unreachable signified is called a transcendental signifier. Transcendental signifier. So, for this child in the real stage, there is no transcendental signifier, but one transcendental signifier. Lacan, as I told you, the theory of Lacan surrounds around one word, and this he calls the transcendental signifier of the being. That all meaning is derived basically from this. All meanings are derived from it. All the definitions of masculinity, femininity are basically derived from it. So therefore he calls this becomes the transcendental signifier, that one signifier that will help in derivation of meaning for everything else that surrounds the world. That is the single transcendental signifier. For Derrida, there is no transcendental signifier which can be taken as the center and fixed where the meaning can be derived. But this again is not in fact an object now. Even then, if you think there is a center from which we can derive a meaning, Lacan says, even then, this is not in fact an object or a reality around which things can be held, which can become the axis around which everything else revolves. Yes, Mahina, it's everything comes from any being. The definition of being comes, according to psychology, it comes from the childhood. Therefore, everything is defined in that manner, the relationship of a child with the mother. That's where the being starts. So, so this becomes then, as per uh, Lacan, how is this a transcendental signifier which actually does not exist? Because this too is not the real object that is ever meant to be. You never think of the object actually making sense uh, to a child, a male or a female child. But then what is it? It is an empty marker. It's an empty marker. It's an empty sign. It's merely a sign which has a signifier, but it has no signified. There is no signified, right? So, what is the marker? How does it become just a sign, just a marker? Because it's only based on the idea of differences. Remember, when we did socio, we learned that that um, a mat is a mat only because it's not a map, it's not a cap, it's not a can, it's not a sea, it's not a pen. This is why you know the meaning of mat. So you understand the meaning of a word from the differences. In here again, you understand this as an object only because it's not everything else, like in the sense of the gender. So this is where we begin. We began at this stage which was called imaginary. Everything was imaginary. The base of everything, the plinth, the base is the same. Imaginary. It's imagined. It's an imagined sign of differences. It's just an empty marker. There is no object. So from here, everything else, if everything else derives meaning from this signifier, and when this signifier does not exist, all theory comes round to Derrida. What is everything then? Everything is only a chain of signifiers, and there are no signifiers. There is even not a transcendental signifier, one center with which you can derive meaning for everything. It's all a chain of signifiers. Now, let's see how he talks about the creation of the unconscious in the same words used by Saussure. The language is Saussure's, but the concept is Lacan's. Fine? Let's come to this. You can write this down and I'll dictate. The unconscious is just a continual movement and activity of signifiers. Copy. The unconscious is just a continual movement and activity of signifiers, whose signifiers are often inaccessible to us because they are repressed. This is why Lacan speaks of the unconscious as a sliding of the signified beneath the signifier, as a constant fading and evaporating of meaning, a bizarre modernist text, which is almost unreadable and which will certainly never yield up its final secrets to interpretation. If you do not understand this, it's very simple. It's what we have already done. It's very simple. What is unconscious created of? This is exactly what unconscious, as per Lacan, is created of. I repeat that he is only making use of the language which comes from Saussure and Derrida, nothing else. So if this is the visible part, which means you know the signifieds of this part. But what about this part, the unconscious? He says what you are sliding down, what you are repressing down there, reaches there only in the form of signifiers because these are the repressed desires. And desires he has already called desires. The definition he gave of desire is the potentially endless movement from one signifier to another. And what do you have in the unconscious? In the unconscious, you have the unfulfilled desires. So this is again the same signifiers, unfulfilled desires. But by the time they are repressed, you don't know what the signified is. And all you have in the unconscious is signifiers. Read the definition again. The unconscious, this part, the unconscious, is just a continual movement. Continual means, and continual does not mean continuous, it means continual, which means uh, day in and day out, with age there is always a movement that's happening. It's not that it happens every day, every hour, every minute. Continual means it stops and then keeps on happening. Movement and activity of signifiers, desires, but in terms of signifiers, whose signifieds, which means the actual object of the desire, is never known because it has already been lost in the symbolic stage. The signified has been lost in the symbolic stage. These signifieds become inaccessible to us because they are now repressed, and when they reach the unconscious, the signified is lost forever. This is why Lacan speaks of the unconscious as a sliding of the signified beneath the signifier. So you just have these repressed desires, but you don't know what the real object of it is. So think of the mirror image that he gave. So he knows what the image that is looking into the mirror, but what is showing up is not the same thing. What is showing up is not the same thing. So that is lost. That object of desire is lost because the signified is sliding beneath the signifier, and what remains is only the signifier. Now, if I use the same language to express the idea of Freud, the interpretation of dreams as per Freud, these signifieds take the form of certain symbols and come out through the royal road called dreams. Okay. So, what do you have? The unconscious. We are still doing the definition of unconscious by Lacan. He again repeats that this unconscious is a sliding of the signified beneath the signifier. So, signified would be the object of desire, whereas signifier is the subject. Subject that desires of something, certain desires. So, what you repress of it remains in the unconscious. It's a constant fading and evaporating of meaning. Meaning, because meaning is in the object. When the object is lost, where will you have the meaning? The meaning is ultimately lost because it fades, it evaporates because it's lost every time something goes into the unconscious. The uh, actual object is lost. The object of desire is actually lost. So what you then have, it's like in your dreams, you see something, you're not sure what they symbolize. Your conscious does not know what it symbolizes because the object is lost. There is something, but what is it actually? You never get an access to that. Unconscious is the inaccessible realm, like we already did. It's the inaccessible realm, beyond signification. Lacan also calls it a bizarre modernist text, like a modernist text we did in Roland Barthes that does not make sense but gives pleasure in reading because it's a readerly text. It involves a writer in a similar way. Unconscious involves the person who deals with it, the psychoanalyst, who tries to reach over to what can this really mean, like a modernist text. So this unconscious is a modernist text where signs do not actually have a signified, but they are just signifiers for you. And there can be varieties of interpretations. So that's modernist text from Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes is also a post-structuralist. A bizarre modernist text which is almost unreadable, which will certainly never yield up its final secrets of interpretations. If it's clear, tell me. If not, let me know. Zohra, they do not have a single signified, but he says that the ultimate signified remains unknown in the real stage. There was a signified, but that was in the stage that precedes this stage. There is a signified only in the symbolic stage. There is a signified, there is meaning to everything. The meaning breaks down when you are switching one, it becomes a chain of signifiers when you are only switching from one signifier to another, only because nothing satisfies reaching at that signified. So no word helps in deriving the actual meaning that you want to reach at. Like a modernist text, you're not yet familiar with the modernist text, what kind of text these are. The word never actually fulfills your need of communication. In a similar vein, these desires, even when completely fulfilled, leave you somewhere incapacitated. That's what a breakdown of binary means. Breakdown, it's not the paradigmatic, it is the paradigmatic relationship, but in the sense that the fulfillment never occurs. I told you psychoanalysis is only read in two senses. One, that you are studying a child on an emotional scale, and there are two kinds of desire, two kinds of emotions that you're reading in a child. One is the desire, the second is the fears. And both of them, you never achieve complete study of them. What fears are they? Say people are phobic about different things. The phobia of, say, height, the phobia of height. You know what phobia of height is, but can you dig down what is the reason behind a person's phobia of height and why you have so many people with same kind of a phobia? The repressions are the same, but can you dig out what repression is it? You have the subject, but the object is lost forever. All you have now access to is the phobia. The reason of that phobia, you don't have access to that. Something has been repressed in some point, in some stage of development. The lack is not, Mahin, the lack is not the Lack, it's not the animal impulses. No, the lack is not that. The lack is being snatched of the object of desire in the initial stage of development, which is the second stage we studied about, the symbolic stage. That entrance of the this